the vision plan for Mockley Park, Boston's largest waterfront park. Beyond addressing its regular flood issue, but utilizing this opportunity to make the park an exemplary 21st century open space with a focus on equity, diversity, community, and viable recreational amenities. He's also he's co-editor of Projective Ecologies and author of the upcoming book Work Life, Study on the Lives and Afterlives of Urban Landscapes. And I can say there are like two main reasons that I really wanted to invite you for the talk. First of all, the firms that are getting the most of the bigger landscape projects in America now, they're actually already getting all the projects 10 years ago, right? So there's not many younger and next generation design offices really emerged since. So I think in that sense, the existence of Stoss and Chris Reed is really important, not just for American landscape architecture discipline, but also for all of you as a kind of future practitioner. And the second, I believe the topic of resilience has been talked in this profession quite a long time, but not many of the design concept really gets built or advanced after the conceptual level. And I think for that, section can play a really important role to make it really a real thing. And in that sense, I think Stoss and Chris is a kind of, not kind of, the best speaker we can invite. So I'm really happy again, and then let's hear what he can explain to us about section and resilience. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks. Thanks for having me, and good to be here with you all. I've set this up as really informal, so as we go along, if you have questions, please do interrupt me or just want to talk. I know we have a moment to be able to have a formal discussion afterwards, but the topic is really quite intriguing. I've never given a talk on section before, although we think in section all the time. And so it was a nice opportunity to actually put some things together to kind of think through some ideas and hopefully start to articulate them at least a little bit coherently. I want to talk about section in a number of ways in terms of how we use it. One is a mechanism for pure speculation, absent constraints of plan and client needs. How is it that we can utilize section or combination section formats simply to project imaginations and ideas into the world? Second, we use it as a form of inquiry, rigorous inquiry, and proposition making. We're particularly interested in how things work a lot, whether it's from a hydrologic standpoint or even from a social standpoint. And section is one of those key tools that we can use to begin to think through those, you could call them functional aspects of a project, but I would call them sort of maybe functional and operational aspects of a project as a way, again, toward design, not necessarily as an end in and of itself. And then third is, I think, a way to bring a number of things together, but also explore and perhaps reveal to others some of the qualitative, dynamic, sensorial, ambient qualities of a place, and particularly when we're dealing with water. Very small changes in section can produce quite dramatic results sometimes. And so help in some ways for us to make evident cycles, environmental cycles particularly, to people within the city that I think goes way beyond the functional aspects of a resilience project. So I want to talk about it in all those ways. The drawing you see in front of you is pure speculation. It came out of a series of conversations that were initiated last fall about how to think about additional wave attenuation in Boston Harbor that would further protect the inner coastline, but also started to think about ways in which those more functional aspects of a project might give rise to other social and environmental effects. At the time, the engineers were putting forward ideas and doing studies, and it was all good, but we felt that there was nothing that really was inspirational to people. And so through a series of conversations we had externally and then within the firm, we simply started to imagine, project, speculate on what that kind of environment could be. Because I believe that this is what's going to get people excited, backed up by the technical analysis of a very good engineering team. And so this is pure speculation. You can see we're playing with scale. Not all of this reads at the same scale to me, but it's done deliberately to give you a sense of the ambiance of Boston Harbor. In a lot of ways, there's a lot of pragmatic thinking that's layered into this work. You can see low and high tide, the 2050 year storm surge levels. All those are indicators and guidelines for us. Water's coming from the right side of the screen, and so those edges need to be higher impact, but it also allows for things on the left side of those barriers to be softer and more lush and support other forms of life. So there's a lot of knowledge built into a drawing like this. There's a lot of knowledge in terms of the different kinds of ecosystems and creatures that will begin to thrive in places like this. But on the other hand, it's pure speculation. It's meant to get people excited about a set of ideas more than anything else. And this is something that we've done in a number of different places. We were asked by the Los Angeles Times architecture critic Christopher Hawthorne, who was doing a piece on California highways, to begin to speculate on the reuse or remaking of a portion of Highway 2 up there. And we really use the section perspective device to think the entire proposal through. This is the project. There's nothing beyond this. There's a plan that came out of this. There's a cross-section that came out of this. But all the thinking and speculating on what the project could be was really derived from the need to produce an image that could communicate to people, but could explain to those in the know how a system like this might work. And so here we were trying to, flip the story of what a freeway is. A freeway divides communities. It's antisocial. It's not very environmental because it sheds water as quickly as possible. It disconnects people from neighborhoods to the river. And this device was trying to do everything in the opposite realm for that. So it's supposed to be a social connector. It's supposed to connect neighborhoods to the river. It was intended to store water and use the water in slow drips to be able to create new ecosystems. It was intended to create shade relief, even small economic opportunity for some of the folks in some of the lower income neighborhoods. And it was also designed to create new recreational opportunities below and even clean the air from the intersecting freeway and automobiles around. And so, in this way, it's a highly developed section perspective with a lot of annotations. Each of those pieces are separately explored somewhere else. But the idea is to use the section as the starting point for a series of speculations on what the future of the city could be, or what the future of this particular piece of infrastructure might be.
Chris, the first description is kind of cut off at the top.
Yep.
What does it say?
That is an air filter.
Oh.
That's bringing in air and through some series of mechanisms is actually helping to take polluting toxins out of the air.
I see.
So that's doing that. There's something here that's about cooling and misting. There's a shade structure which actually doubles as a solar canopy that generates energy. Fog screens that will actually capture droplets of water when there are fog events and bring those down into the landscape as well.
It's kind of machine.
It's absolutely a machine. Yeah. And that's what we called it. I forget exactly what we called it, but some sort of social ecological machine for the city. And even at a detailed scale, it's an opportunity to put an idea forward without actually figuring out how the thing works. This was an idea for a set of floating wetlands in Toronto that would also have the opportunity to feed fish below. But we were very interested in making that evident to people on the surface through some sort of interactive lighting device that would be activated when the fish were feeding. So you'd have this thing floating on the lake, and it would be beautiful in and of itself with plants and all that, but at night it would start to flicker every time fish started to feed. So it added a level, a quality to that proposal that took it from being purely functional and just physically beautiful to something that had a kind of ambient and dynamic quality to it as well. And so it's a very simple way to project an idea without having to figure out what is the shape of it, right? What really is everything that would be required. I mean, we have a couple things in there that say, yeah, there's some stuff required to make this thing float, but the idea is something that we can do, generate really. And so we do this in a lot of ways. This was a 500-acre proposal downtown Dallas, where the proposal was really to take, you can see all the highways that are there, and the highways weren't going away. And so the idea was to connect the downtown to the river with these alternating patterns of neighborhood extensions from downtown and landscape extensions that would push in from the river to the foot of downtown. And those landscape extensions were intended to be really lush forests that would help to mask the freeway, but would also provide other kinds of programmatic activity, including air quality improvement as well. And so here again, we just developed a series of very quick speculations of the kinds of activities that could go on in the forest. We wanted to convey the idea that this was not a refined, pretty, native, or inactive forest, that was actually a site for doing program for hosting activities that couldn't be hosted within the smaller scale spaces downtown, and yet in some ways we're a bit more urban than what you might do in some of the larger river landscapes or landscapes outside of the city. So again, it became a tool for very quick speculation and conveyance of ideas. But the project also embeds a very functional piece to it as well. How is it that we take the old river system and bring it back to life, use the stormwater coming off the city, clean the stormwater using new native habitat, and then with the cleaned stormwater, be able to introduce new open space types into the neighborhoods. And so a lot of this was done through a set of engineering and ecology studies with a team of folks. I'm going to click out of this for a moment, if I can. Because I want to show you a video. so again, the project, there's the water system with 3 major water landscapes. But this is really it's a little pixelated here. But this is a video that begins to explain how that system works, how we're capturing water, both from the city and from the local neighborhoods. This was a key, I'll go back through this in a minute. But that overflow channel and the way in which the channels worked were really critical to the overall ecological functioning. It wasn't just it comes in here, it goes to here. It had to have connectivity across the whole system in case flooding happened in certain ways. And so there's a piece of this. I should really start this. Sorry, I haven't used this video in a while.
Do you need any help from TA?
No, I got it.
Yeah.
But again, water comes in, we're developing a set of catchment basin and canals and channels. And this was the key overflow system. And then all of the basins there were developed as stepped and terraced basins in order to support very particular forms of urban and ecological life. So I'm going to switch back to this thing. So again, in the aviary and water gardens, very simple systems. Beyond the water coming in from outside, the idea of just simply catching water to create these water gardens that would then have dramatically fluctuating water levels over the course of the season. And that you can see inscribed into the overview of this image with water coming in from a number of different sources and a whole series of stepped and terraced basins that are really set up to create both a beautiful landscape but also a highly functional landscape based on the functional requirements of stormwater collecting. And yet, the section in this project was also used very urbanistically. The second piece of the water system was put into a beach. Dallas, this is in Dallas. Dallas is very, 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 very hot in the summer. And the fact that we could create a new urban beach in the middle of the city with some of the clean water, in this case built into the levee that keeps the river at bay, and looking at the various ways where parking and other functions could be buried into the hillside. And so in this sense, we're looking at the section to create hybrids of program, to accommodate multiple programs where we need to, but to create something that's highly urbanized as well. And again, these are, this is a crude version of a section, slightly more refined version of the section which describes parking, an existing highway, UV infiltration, et cetera, et cetera. But it's the way in which that thing in the image is explained to the client in terms of all of what it does, rather than just the kind of visual qualities of what's being proposed. Same thing here. In another part of the site, a water amphitheater, the most intensely developed piece. Again, connecting a lower level to an upper level where we had viaducts that were already in place, and using the underground to support all levels of infrastructure. And so in some ways we're using this section to convey ideas and to design things that are quite functional in a way, but also to be able to compare and contrast even across the 3 different neighborhoods, issues of scale, functionality, program, and overall character. And so on the purely functional front, we do a lot with water, both in a speculative way and a very functional way. This was a competition entry for a park in Taichung, Taiwan. where we were trying to use water to actually cultivate new ecologies, new social programs, new social culture within a part of the city. And yes, we knew some of the water coming in would be fairly clean, and so overall thinking about how the system could essentially be turned on over time as new neighborhoods were being built. We're quite interested not only in capturing stormwater here, but capturing gray water from each of those new neighborhoods, and then how those would be piped into the center of the park. Because we were dealing with both gray water and stormwater systems, we were creating a whole series of basins, some of which were hidden and protected. So the dirtier the water, the more difficult it was to access. So sometimes that started in underground tanks when you really had pure gray water coming into the system. And then gradually, as that water was cleansed through mechanical means and mostly through ecological means, that water was brought into closer contact with people, but we were utilizing that water to create new habitats within the city. It was also interesting because the infrastructure of the park would be put in place, and a lot of these basins would start as dry basins, and then again, as some of the neighborhoods came online, they would start to collect some of the stormwater gray water and would completely change their ecology as these new neighborhoods came online. So in that way, the addition of new development was actually creating more diverse and productive ecologies in the park. But you can see the way in which we're thinking about the very different grades and levels within each of the basins based on the performance on the one hand, and some of the design intention in terms of how we get people down to each of these places. You can see those 3D diagrams translated then into more illustrative vignettes up at the top, and I've got a few to show you. So these are two that are at the more clean end of the spectrum and really show how people can get right down to the water to begin to touch and feel it in various ways. The same ideas we put into practice, we incorporate into the thinking of the projects that we build, even at a very, very small scale. That project, I forget how big it was, but it was hundreds of acres as I remember it. This is 1/4 of an acre on a site in Milwaukee, a former industrial site. This is a site that was once the confluence of 3 rivers as they met Lake Michigan. And of course there used to be a lush and robust series of wetlands at this location that was all replaced by infrastructure and industry and the building of the city. And so the question for us is, how do we just simply re-inaugurate life on a site like this that had been flattened, deadened, filled, etc. And part of it was simply to change the section. This was a dead flat site when we started. Water came onto the site, it ran right into the river, it took all the sediment and the contaminants that were on the asphalt surface, brought it right into the river. And so here we were interested in figuring out how do we recreate or re-inaugurate dynamic cycles within the park. How do we do things like clean the water, improve water quality of the river nearby, and also create opportunities for social gathering and accommodation here. The project itself is really quite simple. In some ways, it's a grove at the urban edge. That grove opens up into a kind of hybrid plaza lawn, and that lawn eventually steps its way down as we get closer to the river. One of the interesting problems here, you see the bulkhead wall. We couldn't change the bulkhead wall because that was too costly, and yet we wanted to create a connection to the river. We wanted people to get lower to it to be able to interact with water in some way. And so the answer to that was to really step down, to excavate behind the wall so that we're lowering grade behind that wall, exposing it so it becomes part of the character and experience of the place. So you're kind of recognizing the industrial history and yet the whole site is set up really to deal with stormwater conditions over time. And so here you see a drawing of how some of that works. During an even normal rainstorm, water will both be infiltrated into the grass areas, but will start to collect in that lower area. That regularly floods now, and that excess water allows us to reestablish a native marsh that's really quite dynamic through the seasons. So the dynamic of water allows us to create another dynamic of vegetation. But at the right edge, we also cut slots into that wall so that if the river is ever high enough, it invades the site. It takes back space within the city. And all of this is really to make environmental cycles evident to people, to make them useful in a way, to give some space for floodwater to go, to use it to create new ecology, but also to make those cycles evident to people.
Mm-hmm.
It may be something that you only learn subconsciously over a period of time, but it becomes part of your embedded experience of the place.
So you still utilize the existing wall structure?
Yep, yeah. We couldn't take it down,
Right.
but you can see on the right how we just cut slots into it that would allow water to get in or water to get out.
But then the ground level changed?
The
You
ground
changed
level
the
came
section,
down.
right?
Yeah, changed the section.
Mhm.
And we were also, there were also a series of underground obstructions
I see.
that those walls and ramps were sort of doing some
Yeah.
gymnastics over. So there was an old foundation that was found that we had to kind of figure out how to deal with. But essentially, that's what creates a little bit of
Sure.
variation.
Yeah.
And here you can see the way in which the marsh planting changes quite dramatically over the course of the season. What you're also seeing here is a seeding strategy, which I'll talk about the social aspects of this in a minute. But seeding and seeding that accommodates different people and body types is something that's at work here. I'll talk about it more in subsequent projects.
Is the fish edible? How about the water quality? You would say.
I'm not sure. Well, it doesn't matter for me. At this point in my life, I
Yeah.
could eat anything. It's not affect me. Gradually, the water quality is improving. I
Yeah.
don't know if I would eat that fish. I don't know if they eat that fish. But interestingly enough, there was a whole community of people that fish already on the site before we started.
Yeah.
And we worked hard to make sure there was accommodation for them to continue to fish. But then in its small way, this site contributes to overall water quality and fish health. And you can imagine if you had 100 of these small things, how
Yeah.
much that would have an impact
Of course.
on the quality. And so that's how we think through section from a hydrologic standpoint. We also think, as I just said, from a sectional standpoint, in the ways in which people use things within the public realm, and how we design for that. Design for things we know, and design for the way in which people will just simply appropriate things that are put in front of them. So I love this example because you've got a very sort of proper picnic table there. Nobody's picnicking on it, but people are using it in really friendly and robust ways. And that, to me, is as legitimate a use of a picnic table as anything else is. And so the idea that we really play on people's curiosities, that we acknowledge that we all have different body types, that we sit in different ways, that we get comfortable in different ways, that we have different moods, and sometimes we want to be alone, and sometimes we want to be in a group, and sometimes it'd be nice to have somebody cuddling with us in our lap. The way in which we can design for that, I think, is really important. And so some of this we started out very early in some of the speculative projects, garden installation projects. This one was interesting because this was a surface rubber that was being used in playgrounds everywhere, flat installation, right? And we had a public client and said we wanted to change the section. we wanted to create form, and they were all worried about it and safety and durability and all this. So we had the opportunity to test this in a garden installation. Of course, these days this is common practice, but 15 years ago there weren't many people doing this. And so we started to explore this idea, both in terms of how you could manipulate the surface to create new and fun and inviting environments, but also there is a technical thing here. The way in which you use this rubber surface is the higher the elevation or the higher the potential fall, the thicker the subbase. It's the subbase really, which is the safety and squishy part. And so you can see the variation in the subbase according to the topography. And so this informed us, essentially what you see here. Something that was highly interactive. You didn't really get it until you moved in it, and once you moved in it, it became very playful and fun. Kids, of course, know how to make up games. This deals with people's curiosity and sense of exploration. We're not telling people what to do. We're just changing the section and seeing how people experiment with that new kind of condition. So this very much influences the way in which we think about the social life of public spaces. And we had great evidence here. The construction manager was quite good at photographing people, and he'd also make people remove their shoes and socks so they could really feel the squishiness. The other fun thing is, because of the difference in the thickness of the squishy part, at the top of the hill it's a little bit more stable, and at the bottom of the hill it's squishier. But as you're running, you don't know that, and all of a sudden there's a different kind of resistance, which will force you to fall onto one another. And so there is a kind of insidious piece to it.
That project to be photographed for the Work-Life publication. That would be fantastic.
That's not there anymore. And the Work-Life project's actually becoming something a little bit different. Its new tentative title is Mise en Scène.
Oh, really?
Which is really about stage setting for this kind of activity. And so we're looking at it in terms of city life, but also in the life of the projects that we're doing. But there is that same kind of connection to it.
Yeah.
So that same thinking was really brought to larger public realm projects like this, and in some ways this is about the social. This project, it's 2.5 acres, like a foot of downtown, on the river. We did have to deal with river flooding issues, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but it was really, how do you create a space that's really warm and conducive to folks, inviting people, whether you're there alone on a Saturday morning or there in a very large group in a celebratory moment. So you may have seen images of this project. Seating device is the basic device, and then this folding strategy and section gets elaborated at much larger scales, and includes even these larger pieces of infrastructure that either step up or step down as you get down to the river. The sectional quality here is everything. The whole idea was to give people choices about how they sit. I'm going to pass this around. I flagged some pages. These are from the CDs, and you can begin to see all the variations of the different benches. Yeah. And so, one of the things we did in the office is take some plywood and just very quickly prototype these things. Prototype angles, prototype the width of a seat, and then everybody in the office sat in them and tested them out. And we weren't trying to make it exactly right for everybody, because you can't, but we were trying to figure out what were the ranges within each of these pieces. And so each of those then informed what was eventually built as a very simple set of sections that allowed for seating and gathering in radically different ways. And I love a photograph like this, where the people have taken on the section of the bench, but are clearly quite comfortable with it. And yet, there are also choices offered. So people can either bring their own chair or sit in any number of different ways. as they so choose. And it's a very simple manipulation of the section using the same materials, the same structural support. Pretty analog, I've got to say, back then. But that same thinking then translated into other projects that you probably know best. The other piece of this is the flooding issue. And in fact, the bench is hiding something. It's hiding a change in elevation, which allows us to provide flood protection to the buildings just next door. It also creates an upper level surface that's just that much higher, so that you have a better view, a sense of projection out over the river, and locks into the finished floor elevation of the new buildings that are immediately next door, which allows the program in those spaces to spill out into the open space and have those two things reinforce one another. It's also the place, as you can see, that water off the surface goes down into the ground and infiltrates. So that one very, very simple thing, and you can see that back row of benches, is actually doing a lot of work.
I just have very maybe too technical question, but could you go back the previous? I mean, there must be some debris kind of that deposited after some time.
Yep.
What was the kind of solution for that?
There's actually a screen underneath the bench.
Ah, I see. Okay.
Vertical screen that captures some of that.
I see.
But it is smaller areas, particularly up top. It's smaller areas, so it's not
much of
collecting a whole lot of debris.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can see in front where we're continuing to slope toward the river. We're using pervious
I see.
paver, which then have their own
This kind of
mechanism for
pitching.
cleaning. But yeah, that's always an issue about
Yeah.
occasional maintenance.
Great.
This water is from the urban runoff.
Yeah, but as you can see here, so this is, the section is essentially here looking that way. And so most of the runoff is coming from a very small margin
I see.
up here.